This is Lessons and Experiences, and this is our 7th webinar, and we are extremely excited to have today's contents. Oh, here it is. So we have Leela Shankar from WAP Sustainability Consulting today, and I'm sure many of you know her from various speaking engagement. She will be navigating us through the seminar, focusing on decarbonization and designer process. So here's a quick agenda of today. We'll be first recapping on the journey, how we got here, and review the tools available to everyone that is collaborative knowledge from the past 6 seminars. So here's a brief journey of our webinars. We started with signing the advocacy letter. So either you yourself or your firm has been signed on the lighting advocacy letter. Okay. And if you maybe forgot what that was or what was about, there's always a reminder to read the letter again. You can find the letter, which is hosted on the Mindful Material website, and then go to the ACT page, ACT button, and then go to the Material Pledge. Then our lighting advocacy letter is the first one being hosted there. Just a quick summary of what is the lighting advocacy letter and then what's the content in it. So it is a letter based on AIA's material pledge, and it focuses on the 5 buckets of the area for lighting, for design making process. Human health, climate health, ecosystem health, social health and equity, and circular economy. So if your firm has not been signed the letter, then I invite you to go to the website, read the letter, and then sign it. If your firm already had signed a letter, still go back to the page and then read that letter again. It's just always a good things to keep it in a fresh in the mind. And that signing the letter was just the starting point for the collaborative action. What is important is coming from here. I also wanted to just give a shout out to how many signatories we have today. We have up to 120 firms signed the letter. This emphasized that how much this matter is an important thing to everybody and then make the decision-making process. So kudos to everybody who signed the letters, and we're very proud. Okay, then coming back to this journey, the past 6 seminars that we hosted are also recorded. So if you had missed any of these, you're more than welcome to join and watch them available. It is hosted on the Mindful Material website. Go to the LAL playlist. It goes to the YouTube link, and then you should be able to access to all the webinars that we had in the past. Also, I'd like to remind everybody that we have a great toolkit available for anyone to use, which is accessed from Mindful Material website here. And what's inside of the toolkit is quite remarkable. I'll just introduce a few of the contents inside. There is a lighting narrative for schematic design that you can actually copy and paste into your spec page if you would like. It explains how many of us take an approach. There's also example lighting fixture schedule, what we like to see in what columns, so that it gives a good idea of what we're focusing on today. There's also a toolkit, the conversation tree. This is pulling the conversation starters in such as corporate wellness programs, ESG agendas, attracting and retaining talent, or just a laser focus onto the bottom line. This tool will be helpful to carve out the conversation. Then it also contains the awesome summary of the building standard and common documentation. I often look at those so that we can actually see what lines up with which labels. And there are a few search engines that is introduced within that toolkit. I know it is hard for all of us to find the light fixture we want with the sustainability labels associated with. So those search engines will help you navigating through. Okay, so without further ado, I am introducing today's guest speaker, Leela Shankar. Based in New York, Leela Shankar leads the lighting design with, Leela Shankar leads the design lab with WAP Sustainability, synthesizing architectural design, sustainability analytics, material innovations, and change management practices. The lab partners with leading stakeholders from design, real estate, and manufacturing to implement strategies furthering decarbonization, circularity, and material health outcomes in the built environment. She has been leading the Green Light Alliances and International Association of Lighting Designers Life Cycle Assessment Incubator, while in-house as a lighting designer with consulting engineering firm BR+A. And previously, we worked global design team. Her work with the Flint Collaborative New York City, a nonprofit 501c3 she has founded, has been recognized by the Illuminating Engineering Society with special citation for lighting as a tool for social impact. Leela is a steering committee member of the American Institute of Architects Decarbonization Committee and contributing member of the New Museum of Contemporary Art's New Ink Incubator. Welcome, Leela.
Thanks, Reiko. Thanks, everybody, for taking time to be here today. It's a really, really special project that I care a lot about, that was started by a lot of people that I care about and respect greatly, including yourself, Reiko, and Alexandra Christiana. Thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to this movement. I really want to add to that and also take a moment to really revisit where we've got to after several years of all of these resources being created. It's really exciting to see that we can't claim to be lacking in data or in direction anymore. And so the onus is on all of us to really start to put it into action. And that's where I hope today can be maybe more of a working session than a one-way presentation, and it can be a little bit loose, so please feel free to pipe up. Big shout out to everyone who's at a watch party. That's so fun. So friends in Boston and DC and New York, thank you so much for getting people around the table. And that's my experience too, that it's much more fun and much more realistic to get moving when we've got a few people feeling like we're part of a community doing that. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Let me know if this is all looking good to you. Okay. Is that showing just as the slides, or?
It's the slide and the little thumbnails.
Okay, I'll just go full screen.
That looks good.
Yeah, just the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think Reiko's already done a fair bit of introduction, and I know that we're a little late to start. So we'll just click forward to say that, I know that there's certain students watching as well from the Parsons MFA lighting program. And I wanted to just kick off by saying that in the current construction climate and economic climate that we're working through, there's a lot more that we're taking into account beyond just beautiful lighting design and the aesthetics of playing with the medium of light that I was once very excited by when I was still coming out of the Parsons program some years back. but it's really layered up to be a concern about site, a concern about how we engage community, and certainly now this concern for legacy of our projects and how we engage with our designs over time. So these are just images from a Fleet Collective project that was a very short-term thing, but then we jumped to our projects that we're now designing as 2030 and 2050 projects coming through. So for example, this is a 3.3 million square foot project that I was part of contributing to with Borealis Lighting Studio, or BR+A engineering firm in New York, based out of Boston. And there's certainly a lot of weight that we can have when we have these large projects, because we've got the quantities of a scale that we can ask for things that we might not have asked for before. And Reiko and I were having a conversation about that. Same thing with WeWork. You know, that was something that had global quantities, and we could really push move the dial on requests of manufacturers. But I want to say that today is really about smaller projects and sharing some of the successes that can happen even when you've got a one-off project with one floor. This is a project that I was working on with architects who are former WeWorkers, that was actually down in Bentonville. It was something that I'm really proud of, because we were able to actually get a very large quantity of the decorative fixtures as well as the workhorse architectural fixtures to have life cycle assessment reporting and environmental product declarations coming through. So I just want to speak a little bit more about what you can do as a designer in perhaps a smaller firm, regardless of whether you think that you've got a lot of bargaining power today. So today we will focus the discussion in three parts. One, as a little bit of an update on where we're at in industry developments as a lighting sector, as well as from our partners in engineering and architecture. Then a little bit about what we can actually do practically to implement the data that we're getting out of life cycle assessment. And then just noting where things might be heading after that, and hoping that you feel comfortable piping up whenever you want. So just returning to the lighting advocacy letter as an initiative of the AAA's material pledge, we're drilling down today into the climate health question and really looking at embodied carbon, which for the sake of simplicity, just in case there are folks on the call who may not be as familiar with that, we're really talking about the non-operational, non-keeping the lights on in the building energy emissions. So carbon emissions associated with energy to produce our luminaires and move them around from, you know, the raw material phase to manufacturing facilities to site, and repairing those on site, and also then moving them into their end of life phases, whether that's recycling or landfill or reuse. What is GWP? It's global warming potential, and that's basically a metric that is coming out of these reports that we're starting to get familiar with. And that's really talking about kilograms of carbon dioxide or equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason that we're really focusing in on that particular metric, as opposed to a lot of other metrics that we get from life cycle assessment, is because it contributes to the heating of the Earth's atmosphere, which is the thing that really, as countries and global citizens, we're caring about and we're trying to take a lot more action on. So GWP is a figure that we will be focusing in on to pull out of the tables of numbers that we're getting from these reports. So just quickly, there's a lot of really exciting developments that I'd like to share. But as this was really about decarbonisation as a topic, just want to note that I think the lighting industry is doing a really fantastic job, and the lighting advocacy letter is doing a fantastic job of helping us move towards greater transparency, which is disclosure from our manufacturer friends as to what the current impact of our luminaires is looking like. That's the first important step towards being able to reduce our impact. which decarbonisation is really about. And that's the hardest step, arguably. And that's where we really want to move forward together as a community to try and figure it out. So one of the exciting things that I'd like to share is, speaking from New York here today, there is now a embodied carbon baseline study that's been put out to tender from the Mayor's office, several arms of the Mayor's office, seeking for their academic partners to bid for a study which is really looking at different typologies of buildings, setting embodied carbon baselines, whether that's for new construction or retrofit. This is really new. The bids will only be received in May. And so I'm just noting that there's exciting work to come and questions that will be asked for manufacturers of common building materials for all of these typologies to develop embodied carbon baselines for these materials and buildings. And that will cover life cycle phases from cradle to grave, which is going beyond the manufacturer's typical scope, which is cradle to gate. Similarly, from our friends in MEP at MEP 2040, they will be releasing their new embodied carbon guide in a couple of weeks. So April 22nd, there's a specific guide that I contributed to, and that I'm sure others of you will really want to take a look at, that is looking at how we create takeoffs from our Revit models to actually get closer to understanding how we can then get to carbon intensity figures. So look out for that. I'll certainly share that with Alexandra and Reiko so that we can be part of that movement. And I think the more that lighting can feed into the work of MEP 2040 and our friends in electrical and plumbing and mechanical, the better. So in terms of lighting, I know that I've been part of work with many of you as part of the Green Light Alliance and International Association of Lighting Designers Life Cycle Assessment Incubator. And we started this journey a few years back and really had three aims. One being to build community around this work of trying to assess our current impact on embodied carbon, and one being about trying to get harmonized standards so that we're not all having to learn multiple different approaches to measurement, and then get into some actual hardline figures on measurement. And so where we're at is really that there's a wonderful coalition of allies, and we really want to grow that sense of community, both from within lighting, but also around us, from architectural friends, engineering friends, developers. And the quality of data that we're getting is important, but then application of that data is even more important if we're really going to talk about decarbonisation, not just pulse taking. Where we're at in terms of harmonisation is that we've got a set of standards that are developing. There is a set of rules called product category rules for the North American market that is being evolved, that should hit the streets in the next few months. And that has been based off the standards that were applied for this industry work through the Life Cycle Assessment Incubator that came off a European standard, the PEPICO Passport standard. In terms of baselines, we've got some initial preliminary research that is coming out of the incubator with 5 environmental product declarations for typical products. So that is really a first step towards looking at what our order of magnitude impact can be for typical fixtures, which is really exciting. So just as background, this was the kind of trajectory. Hard to believe that it was 2020 that we kicked this all off, and here we are in 2025, inching closer, but we have actually got to the process of verification with the draft life cycle assessment report and 5 industry EPDs, and we're very close to being able to share that publicly. And how that feeds into our design tools is obviously that we want to be able to respond to different voluntary standards on life cycle assessment, you know, being able to talk about our impact in terms of embodied carbon. that we want to do our own internal assessments of what the carbon budget of our designs might be. And we also want to share some schematic level assumptions about lighting and lighting layouts with our friends who are energy modeling whole building life cycle assessment. So the fixtures that we zoomed in on were these 5 workhorse architectural fixtures. And interestingly, they do align with the kinds of projects that have tended to be low in MEP data, according to the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standards industry study of a couple of years ago. So you'll see that some of the specs here, the performance criteria for the luminaires themselves are listed. They were determined by lighting designers who were involved at the beginning of this incubator process. And we were trying to think about good design, not just the most commonly specified or cheapest fixtures. So this is something that could certainly move in future, but this is where we landed. And the preliminary results of the global warming potential figures for each of those luminaire types are thrown up on screen here. You'll also see them in the published EPDs when they're available. But you see that there's a difference between the cradle to gate number, which is basically the global warming potential associated with making the luminaire before it goes to site. And then the cradle to grave figures, which are really about use phase for the life of the building's design. And it, can be up to 10 times more, really. And that's really because of we're leaving these luminaires on for maybe 20 years, 10 years, it depends. And so that's quite natural, not just for lighting, but for all sorts of built environment products or even consumer goods. So not shocking, but it does say that this is based on a particular point in time measurement with the energy grids being as they are, with the proportion of renewable energy mix to fossil fuel mix. That will shift over time as well. And it's specific to location. So in this case, we were talking about using a global average energy grid figure as the coefficient for calculating use phase emissions. But in any case, it's interesting to note that the heavier fixtures maybe intuitively do have a higher global warming potential, like the trophers and the linears, compared to the lighter fixtures that have relatively more metal. And the post top, similarly, it's a big, heavy, this is without the post, we should say, has an energy intensive and therefore high global warming potential figure associated with the creation of that. So when we start to think about the relative proportion of the materials that go into those different types of luminaires, that also starts to maybe explain a little bit more about why we get to the figures we do with the different ultimate global warming potential figures. And you can see that those with more metal, as I was mentioning before, have maybe produced the higher GWP figures. And that's because it takes so much energy to be operating an aluminum smelt, for example. So one of the things that we would want to be thinking about is how much recycled aluminum can we actually consider asking for in our luminaires. And I can see some folks trying to get closer to the screen to check this out, and I'm happy to share some of those figures afterwards as well in these slides, and happy to take some questions now or later. But it's really interesting to start to see plastics versus certain components like the LED module and the driver contributing proportionately as hotspots to each of these luminaires.
Lisa, there's a quick question that came in the chat that, like, if the assumption was the nominal 4-foot fixture, I believe
the assumption was the
nominal 4-foot fixture for the linear.
Yes, it was, and it was for the downlight only, so not uplight and downlight. So that's something that we have to be very careful with, and it's a great question because linear fixtures, unlike the other types, really you have to be careful with what you're taking as the measured unit, because it is per foot that we often report impacts in. And you do need to consider whether it's up, down, because that will often mean more drivers to be controlling the output. And because drivers are a big contributor to the hotspots, that's something that we model in the scenarios. So yes, short answer was that this was the 4-foot linear.
Great.
So, I mean, if you compare the downlight as a very small piece of metal compared to the 4-foot linear, all of this becomes a bit more intuitive. One thing just to note, the very same fixture compared across different locations, because of the fact that use phase impacts are in the range of 90%, again, using different energy grid mixes for the current state of play. Take a look at the location impacts across different cities and also regional estimates. So we've used the global average for all of the tables that we're going to talk about later. But if, for example, you look at the Paris grid, which is largely nuclear, the same fixture is going to appear to be a lot lower impact. So there's questions here for us as a sector as to whether we want to ask for certain scenarios to be set so that we're always looking at a certain, for example, global energy grid to be reported in addition to other regional grids, which might be required by the reporting requirements or legislative requirements in different places where our projects live. So of course it leads to a lot of questions on our part. You know, what do I look out for? What is the difference between an industry environmental product declaration versus product specific EPDs? You know, which phase has the highest impacts? Lots of questions growing out of all of this work. Too many probably for one hour session, but it's something that we would love to keep working on together and would welcome the conversation to continue well after today's session, but we'll try and answer some of them now. So we were definitely going to now zoom into some practical applications and wanted to note that we as designers have a lot of swaying power and influence on the kind of change that we can enact. And this is a wonderful graphic that's come out of a paper from the ILFI, which Alexandra pointed me to as well. And it's heartening because we just want to really celebrate the fact that we as specifiers have great potential to make a difference in reducing impact and decarbonisation because of the kind of spend that we're controlling and that we're part of this sector, the built environment, that has such a high impact on global decarbonisation efforts. If we return to the lighting advocacy letter, we want to zoom in now on two of the things that we're saying we should all be able to do in this moment, which is focus in on the large quantity items in our schedules and build a product database of those green lighted products, as it's called here, from manufacturers who can provide the kind of information that we want from a material transparency perspective, but also eventually the actual figures for global warming potential that we're curious about. Now I'm going to return to where we left off at Leducation, a lighting conference in New York here a couple of weeks back. It was a panel with myself and Alexandra Christiana from HF Architects and Scott Roos from Acuity. And in considering what it is that we could all do next, Alexandra left me with a very powerful statement and the audience that we should just think about one project that we can really zoom in on, because a lot of this can feel quite overwhelming. But it is very possible for us to say with each project, we're just going to make one tiny step, take one step forward with a new product that we add to our palette, or a new client partner or manufacturing partner that we're doing this with, and build that community out. So in the interest of time, I might circulate these questions a little later, but this is a journaling exercise of sorts where we just can take a little moment to reflect outside the busyness and craziness of our construction cycles. Which fixture is it that I specify the most of? And certainly this is where I started to create the business case for asking for certain reporting requirements on fixtures that we have high quantities. And I'd ask of all of us here today, whether that sits from one project or whether we can actually scale up quantities to create more of a business case to ask for the reporting across projects or maybe across the year. And whether within our firms, we may be able to create scale to support those manufacturers and those products that are really demonstrating a willingness to commit to decarbonisation efforts. The second thing is, which client do I work most with? And that's similar to the question of which rep or manufacturer do I work most with, because there is definitely an education process that we're all part of in creating a community of people working towards these values. Then there are really practical questions that we can think about, like which of my luminaires actually included recycled metal content, because that's a very easy thing that people should be able to report on in their luminaires spec sheets. Similarly, thinking about whether we have replaceable drivers, replaceable LED boards, so that we can actually repair the luminaires rather than, as we've seen with the with LED technology, sometimes the entire housing is thrown out, which as a large piece of metal is not a good embodied carbon outcome. So we want to keep that housing in play as long as possible. And then, of course, which of the typical spaces that we're designing might have repeated layouts that we can start to get a sense of carbon intensity for typical spaces that we use again and consider reducing over time as we start to add to our palette of products that have global warming potential information on them. Reiko, I'm not sure if there are particular questions that you answered here that surprised you or that started to make you think. I know that we did this exercise together recently.
So even though I have many manufacturers come in and then educate us with their wonderful information, I admittedly don't have a lot of knowledge that I keep it in myself about which recycled contents are in it. That's something that I gotta have to go back to my notes and then see where I should be having another level of focus on how and whose products can we replace the LED boards, the drivers, and then what's the longevity of how to keep the fixtures running for the long time to contribute this. That is another piece that I need to keep my focus ground down.
Yeah, I think that the materials conversation is one that's definitely related to the questions we've been asking manufacturers on the material health side. And to the extent that that's a place that we can, sink our teeth into in a very tangible way, it's a great place to start. And I think, as we found from, and I know Chelsea Kreilsheimer from SEED is here too, I know that on the ILD's Lifecycle Assessment Designer Task Force, we've been having a lot of these conversations with peers from the UK and around the world, that this is a perspective shift to think about the end of life of our designs in a very serious way and how we might have a longer term relationship with these projects. So thanks for that. So in a really practical sense, I'm thinking that there are three things we can start to really try and work on. One, as our process for collecting data has to start moving along, we can streamline that by having our own sense of in-house performance criteria. That can be something that we always have, and we don't necessarily have to go backwards and forwards asking the client if they want something or not, or if this project is in fact just LEED certified to drive these conversations. We don't ask clients what CRI they want, color rendering, fidelity. We as experts can put this forward in front of people because they don't really know what to ask for. So I think starting to know what we are wanting to see in projects, and then always starting from that place as a preferred request, is in fact a process of streamlining. And in the same way that manufacturer friends have started to create systems for asking for data from their suppliers, we can also create these systems for recording which products in our designs have information available and are performing at a certain level. So to that second point, being selective and choosing to specify from manufacturers who are on that journey, even if they don't have environmental product declarations yet, there is space to actually require that documentation by submittal phase, for example, and we'll get to that in the spec section. So having preferred criteria, it can go into specs without saying that it's required. As with all things in submittals, we can also accept less at a later date, but this is really important, signaling to the industry that it matters. And the third thing is I'm suggesting that we should let it bid. Let it bid, let it bid. So let it go through the commercial contracting process, documenting the choices that we were selective about and seeing what those prices come back as, especially if we know that there are certain manufacturers who have the information that we want, and including specs for manufacturers who may not. Because my experience so far in the Bentonville project, as I was mentioning before, is that they are in fact price competitive now. So for those workhorse fixtures, it is very possible to be supporting manufacturers who have the data that we want. So, I'm going to start to move a bit faster actually, because I know we have 15 minutes left and it would be good to have a little bit of question time as well. But we can certainly start to think about in our process how we have a process to get quantity takeoffs. Chelsea, I know that Chelsea from Seed is on as well, and I think I thought you were going to pipe it up a little bit about the process that you've been going through, having gone from Atelier 10, a very large firm with systems, to a smaller firm, if there's anything you'd like to share on that front.
Yeah, so I'm Chelsea Kralsheimer, as Leila mentioned. So previously I was a senior lighting designer at Atelier 10, which is a sustainability company first that had lighting design as a discipline within that. So I had a dual role in lighting and sustainability. And in October of last year, I moved to The Seed, which is a spa lighting design firm based in New York. And so we've recently took a look ahead at our 5-year plan. And through that visioning exercise, our team agreed that we'll continue to center sustainability as one of our core values. And we have multiple projects in progress that have sustainability values, to Leila's point about the variety of projects that have sustainability values, where it's somewhat easy to present this work and very exciting for people for our clients and architect friends to hear about LCA and how lighting is moving the needle forward. And then we, of course, have smaller projects, fit outs, residential projects where that's not necessarily on the forefront of the conversation. And we're having internal discussions right now about what type of benchmark do we want to set internally as far as requirements for projects, even where that's not the goal. So that being said, just that it's a work in progress to come up with a system that works internally for a smaller firm versus a larger firm. At A10, most of our projects were coming to us for sustainability reasons, so it wasn't hard to sell the sustainability aspect of things. And it's just kind of flipping that narrative on its head at Seed. And then Leila and I have been talking about quantities. And at Atelier 10, it was much easier to pull quantities from all of our projects because we had a scheduling system and a Revit system where we could pull that information out in like 2 hours probably from all the projects of an entire year. And Seed has not historically been tracking quantities on projects in that same way. So how can we take a look back at how much we've specified in the past and how much we're projected to specify and leverage that total quantity that Leila was talking about across not just the projects that care about sustainability, but across our whole portfolio of projects.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'm not sure, Alexandra, if you had anything to add there at the moment, or we'll just keep running through. I know that HMHF have been doing really interesting work creating criteria as well. Oh, it might be tricky with the watch party. Watch parties are fun though. Okay, we'll just keep going. Maybe there'll be a way later. That's fine. Okay, so one of the key questions is, okay, where can we go to find environmental product declarations? I think the first thing should be asking our network, partly because they can be a really fast response, but also it's again about this signaling. So that is one place. Then we can do searches online in the same way that we search for products. Program operators are the publishers of environmental product declarations. There's a lot of different ones around the world, and they all list the ones that have been published through them. So it's kind of like going to a sales rep for many different brands of products. So I know that Giuseppe Carappa, who's a PhD candidate at the moment, who is researching lighting life cycle assessment, is on as well. And we've been talking about his incredible manual process for going and searching for all of these lighting EPDs, and it's up to 631 of third-party verified publicly available EPDs online. These names you'll see are some of those sources. So if you just type in PepsiCo Passport or EPD International or any one of the others, you'll find that you can then search for lighting products on their website. My go-to as well is certainly industry resources like the Green Light Alliance Lifecycle Assessment Incubator, because I know that those manufacturers involved have them as well. But we can start to build out this source together. Then there are also built environment databases like EC3. Typically, EC3 itself has been focused on cradle to gate information, so that's A1 to A3. Whereas now we are wanting really A1 to C4 cradle to grave information. Also, there's been somewhat more limited lighting information that's more available to people with pilot access in EC3, but there are other databases, including some that WAP is taking forward, that will be extending that and responding to industry calls for more. So let's assume we now have some of those EPDs, then we want to think about the criteria that we're going to say we're asking for. And a race through these, obviously in the past at SD level, we'd think about code, and certainly global warming potential baselines are coming through ASHRAE for certain built products. Then we want to think about whether it's a long life project or a short-term 5-year turnaround, in which case maybe circularity concerns and replaceability might be of greater concern. We want to consider where the plants or facilities are located for production of the fixtures, because that will increase the impacts associated with the A1 to A3 phase, cradle to gate, and also the closeness or the distance between the factory and the job site, because that will reduce transport. Packaging concerns are some that we're also considering. We've spoken a little bit about design for disassembly and the materials included, so recycled content. And all that to say that we're just going to add criteria to the existing criteria that we would usually consider, like lumen output, but now we're thinking about writing in the description with a lot more detail. In addition to that, lifetime is a critical element that also starts to play into the formula for impact, which we'll get to. So one of the things that we want to keep in mind is the quality of data that we're getting. If any people are worried that we're asking for something that is too expensive, TM65.2 is a lighting specific free calculator to CIBSE members. So it's a UK originated methodology for MEP products to get embodied carbon data going. It's just embodied carbon. It's not all the other life cycle assessment indicators, but it's certainly getting things moving, and there's a North American version that is available now. One thing about it is that because it's easier to work with and doesn't ask for all of the product specific data of a supply chain, There are multipliers to allow for not having to ask for all of that data, which is tending to show that they're overestimating global warming potential impacts by about 30% for lighting. Then we want to just be very careful when we're reading the documents that we know we're really comparing apples with apples right now, because there's a lot of different variables that you may miss in the underlying analysis, like the grid value, like the actual other performance criteria of the fixture that you're looking at, like the location of the manufacturing facilities or recycled content and so on. But comparability is a really important issue that we're trying to address as an industry. So in then looking at specs, just quickly sharing that, you know, there are certainly precedents that have gone out to industry that I've been part of using, and would be very happy to go into this in more detail. But noting hotspots, noting the global warming potential figure, or calling for reports that also align potentially with green building frameworks like LEED. So really what we're trying to get to are our 3 name spec, 3 manufacturers who can provide that. And then starting to get to carbon intensity baselines by looking at the quantities of luminaires we have and pulling that together with the global warming potential figures that we have. So coming to an example of a very, very simple typical space of a single person office or 2-person office, we have obviously different luminaires that we could use, whether that's any of these downlights or linears or troffers that we included in the industry study. And you would go to the EPD table of numbers and actually pick out the global warming potential figure for cradle to gate, if we're looking at A1 to A3, pick out the figure, and then we do the calculation that actually shows, in the same way that we would do units times cost as a budget, we have a carbon budget. So we'll end up with a figure that actually suggests a certain absolute number for that layout, but then an intensity, carbon intensity figure takes that in terms of a certain area of space. So for example, in this case, we could get to 0.5 kilos of CO2 per square foot. If we want to actually consider cradle to grave, the interesting conversation around functional unit is trying to normalize all the different luminaires that we have to a base performance of 1,000 lumen output and 35,000 hour lifetime. That's trying to capture comparisons where we're really caring about how much light we can get out of a certain fixture and also durability of that over time. This is something that I know is going to be probably a little bit more complicated for lighting designers to, or anyone really, whole building life cycle assessment friends as well, to be implementing, in that it's a new metric, but it is something that can help with schematic level assumptions very early on in our carbon estimates for a building, for example. And if we have some typical spaces and we just want to consider using a certain approach of luminaires over another one, it can be handy that way. So returning to the 3 things that I think we can really try and enact in our practice, definitely streamlining and making it simple by having in-house criteria that we then communicate to the world and allow to be commercially bid. I think we'll start to get some movement, starting with one project, one product, and one partner. And if we want some help with that, definitely suggesting that community around this work is what's going to help us all. I know that we have friends in Boston and certainly New York, and Chelsea at Seed and Alexandra and Reiko in Boston, suggesting that we attempt to get people around a table who need help with specs, want to just ask some basic questions about who people are having success with over the course of May, June. So we'll share some dates on that. But thanks for your time, and would love to answer any questions that we have time for.
Thank you, Leila. I'm not sure like how you can come up to the screen and then ask questions, but like if anybody has questions.
It looks like Sarah has one.
I'm going to try to unmute if that works. Hi,
Hey,
Leela.
Sarah.
My battery might run out, but I'll try to get a question in. Thanks so much for joining us. So much good stuff that I hope we can wrap into the next version of the toolkit. I'm curious if we have done an EPD on incandescent, because when you were showing us all of those graphs about, especially, the difference between cradle to gate and grave, I'm just curious if we've kind of compared that and wondered if that's something we should benchmark.
That's a really interesting question. Thanks, Sarah. I know that there was a study on the lamp, that was done by PNNL, but it's quite a while back. And the question as to whether we want to do that again is interesting. I know that there was a study that one lighting designer actually did in the UK a couple of years back that was shared through the Lifecycle Assessment Incubator. So very happy to share that. I think it's a good one to maybe compare LED technology production with older technologies that are starting to be outlawed as well. I know that the DOE's paper that was released at the IES conference last year, research symposium, was showing that 50% of the buildings that they were measuring were still not using LED technology. So I think there's an argument that we can help contribute to that, and it's certainly more compelling with data behind it.
Question, and that's really interesting thought about that incandescent. Anybody else?
Leela?
You have to come over here to be by the. Come over to the microphone.
Hey, Ira.
Do you have any history of projects that have gone through this process and have been successful?
And by successful, you mean that we actually were able to have a carbon estimate, or that we were able to meet our in-house target for reporting?
So specifier specifies products that meet the criteria. The submittal process goes through, the products are installed, and the owners realized the efforts of the design team.
There is the project that we're sharing there on from Bentonville is, I think, the one that I always point to in terms of it being complete. And I think that is something where we managed to have our ideal set of partners and products on the project, mainly because, I was aware of which manufacturers are sort of up to date, and that it was a fairly fast turnaround. And so we've actually been able to say it happened. Whereas some of the larger projects, it does take a long time for us to see results, for them to go out to bid, and for, that contractor to be through and things to be installed. So this is where I sometimes wonder if the shorter term projects are going to be a really important space for us to focus in on, and therefore the smaller firms as well doing really interesting hospitality work or retail work. This offers us a forum to actually set precedents, to say this is what it looks like and this is what it costs in a carbon sense as much as a dollar sense, and have something to compare to than these huge campuses that'll probably take another 10 years to even evaluate.
Sure. The other follow-up was that when in your terminology leaded bid in your presentation, I was thinking that, like I know you're familiar with Borealis's approach to sort of suggesting that even though you don't have maybe the declare labels or the certifications now, but by the time, if you are successful in winning a bid and we list you on the spec, that by the time the shop drawings hit our desk, you need to have that. Otherwise, we'll disapprove the product. I was thinking that if design firms are taking that risk of doing that, and then the manufacturer doesn't come through with the documentation, and the contractor is then forced to buy a different product than what they thought they were going to buy. How do we control that not impacting cost to the owner? Because the contractor now maybe cut a deal with a certain rep at a certain price, and now that manufacturer doesn't come through with the documentation that was requested, and now that contractor is forced to go buy a different product that wasn't part of the deal that the contractor initially made. How do we protect ourselves from that?
I think that's a great question, and I would actually welcome more conversation from the room around it too. I suspect that the contractor may be selecting fixtures that are actually of lower quality potentially. I suspect that it won't be a cost issue. It would be more our performance criteria suffering, so that's a shame. But I would welcome other thoughts. Reiko, do you have thoughts on that too?
I actually do. So we have the very similar approach, asking of the like declare label or third party transparent material disclosure. And then actually once I had the project that was having a difficult time meeting the shipment timing because manufacturer was holding the fact that they had not been ready to share the label. And then when we realized that, we quickly said that like that cannot be the reason to hold the shipment, and then like we released it without having that label. Of course, the promise was they're still working on it, and the process of the label was still taking longer. And in fact, I did receive the labels, I wouldn't say a year later, but I think anybody who's actually signed up to provide the labels because we have the order by then, they can't just ignore the fact that they got the order and then not work on it. The label being late shouldn't be the reason to be penalized on it. I think the effort to get the first label from the manufacturer is very welcome. That was kind of how I took it. Especially it was more of we were driving that. The one step forward, not the clients or the lead was the driving factor. Then I think there's a really much more like hard cutoff line to it. But because it is more the move that we're trying to drive and then push forward, any of the effort that is making the needle forward is welcome, and it shouldn't be the reason to get kicked out.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that.
our firm.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Leah.
Corey, yeah, no.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say something that our firm has been doing is, to get a cost competitive job, either starting with one rep and packaging the whole project with that rep out of the gate. And then we'll know like their top manufacturers that are doing declare labels or EPDs or whatever it may be. And so we'll hold those for the 3 biggest ones. Or if we're writing a 3 or 4 name spec, whatever it might be, it's going out to the other rep agencies saying like, okay, we will cross this, but it has to also be this equally sustainable manufacturer from someone else's rep agency. So you're doing good no matter who it gets bid out to.
That's exciting, and I'm very curious to hear more about how you're finding the reps play off each other. Are you in Boston, or where are you based?
Our firm is based in San Francisco.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Nice. Definitely want to hear more about that.
Yeah,
I know that Reiko is probably going to kick us off time-wise, so.
Okay, sorry. I was just
No,
gonna say
you're
another
good. You're
thing
good.
that
Yeah.
we do to like bake in the sustainability is look at, like, we understand, I think kind of like the study you shared, that the operational carbon is way more over the life cycle of the fixture, the important piece, than cradle to gate. Not saying cradle to gate is not important, and I know that's part of the push for this, but we'll look at manufacturers who are using optics, or for example, optics where we can push the spacing really, really far, maybe with indirect lighting only for comfort for people's eyes on a white ceiling, and then we're kind of almost baked into a one name spec, because if we use some really good performance optics, nobody else can meet that spec.
Yes, that's true too. So when you have really great optics that allow you to have fewer fixtures, I realize that that probably wasn't something that I made very clear. The fewer fixtures, the fewer lighting layers, the better. Obviously, from a point of view carbon perspective, less material means a better global warming potential figure. Hi, Melissa.
We have our little watch party here in DC, so I just wanted to come on and say thank you so much for being here. One of the questions that, well, I guess maybe it's more of a comment that came up for me was, I think so far in the lighting world, most of the information that we've been seeing is on material transparency, mostly around the declare label. And so like that's been the main metric that we've been able to work with so far as like what we're holding specs to. And I was thinking about the transition like that we're going to have to go through at some point where we start like looking for and asking for EPDs as that information becomes normalized for us in the world of lighting. And it feels like kind of overwhelming to think about like moving from, I guess it feels like a big ask, and material transparency like in and of itself like felt like a really big ask. And so this will also feel like even a bigger ask of our manufacturers and like of like, how we're doing our projects. So I really appreciated the suggestion of just like focusing on one project, and especially like something where we have a lot of impact with like larger scale and whatnot. So that makes it, instead of like thinking about like our overall office processes, like just kind of focusing in on one project makes it feel like bite size. So just wanted to say thank you for that suggestion as well. And hello from all of us here in DC, even though you can only see me.
No, great to see you too. And yeah, I do think that we have to be sensible about where we start to ask as well, because it can go the other way just as much where and I've seen this, now with my WAP hat on, where we've got manufacturers saying a designer is asking for declare labels on everything, and that's maybe not feasible, or do they really know what they're asking for? And I think working with our manufacturing partners to say, all right, I have a sense of the time commitment to do this or the cost commitment to do this, so let's just work on the one where there's a return on investment to do that is a good place to start. And I'm very curious whether manufacturers are starting to consider TM65 as a free or very, very low cost place to start. I know that Scott Roos from Acuity has been working on that himself. So I'm not sure if anyone else is starting to dive into that on this call. It was only very recently that there's a North American version introduced as well. So I think it might be something that there would be interest in sharing a little bit more about in another forum.
Yeah, I think so.
And also, I think that everybody's voice will help, or maybe threat all the manufacturers and the design community that like we should be asking these questions, and then normalize the question too.
Yeah, I think that, watching how material health became such a successful movement in the lighting industry, that's credit to you, Melissa, Reiko, Alexandra, that is proof that it can happen, provided it's done in a sensible, measured way. And I think that's exactly what we want for life cycle information as well. And noting that we do need to think about it as a business case, because right now there probably isn't the level of regulation that's going to push that forward for the lighting sector.
Is there any more comments or questions to Leela? I don't want to keep all of you too long, but I wanted to make a comment about like just a quick recap of from Leela, your webinar. I really like the two words, the carbon budget I think we focus so much on the actual budget or the light power density that we're already accustomed to think about it, but carbon budget is something that we need to keep our earth safe. So we're gonna have to keep really thinking seriously about that. And also the professional recommendation piece that you said, that not everybody would know what to ask for. So we have to be the one to bring out the information they need to take as a professional recommendation. You know, that doesn't happen without getting all this education. So thank you so much for this opportunity to learn about this. And then I think we all have to like digest this in so that we can bring the good recommendation to all, our projects.
Thank you, Reiko. Yes, I think that it is definitely something that we as a specified community and in collaboration with our manufacturer friends should be thinking as something of a consensus project to define what good, better, best performance looks like from an embodied carbon perspective. So much more fun to do it together.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Unless anybody has a comments, then I am closing out that webinar. I don't know if anybody else needed to